All right, good morning, everyone, and good evening in Italy. Welcome to the 6th meeting of the Pirandello Society of America's initiative, Pirandello on Air. I would like to start this meeting by taking a quick look at a photo that is very dear to me. This is a photograph, as you can probably tell, of Jorge Luis Borges, probably the most famous Argentine author, from 1977, during the first and only encounter between him and the most famous 20th century poet of Italy, Eugenio Montale. So in 1977, it was the only encounter that I ever had. According to Borges, when they met, they talked come vecchi amici che si ritrovano anche se non si erano mai incontrati. But you can probably see from this photo that Montale was a bit more skeptical about this interpretation. The connection between the two is not that far-fetched, however. Montale's father, Domingo, had crossed the Atlantic to take a job in Buenos Aires right before marrying Montale's future mother. But even before he reached the coast of Argentina, unfortunately, the company went broke that had offered him the job. So Domingo Montale had to return to Italy. And so Montale became an Italian writer instead of an Argentine one. And later on, Montale, commenting on the meeting with Borges, he wrote, "Se mio padre fosse rimasto in Argentina, io sarei diventato un argentino, sarei diventato uno scrittore spagnolo, sarei diventato un avversario, non un nemico, ma un cattivo avversario di Borges. Invece mi è toccato di fare lo scrittore italiano." Unfortunately, Borges did not have the chance to meet in person Italy's most famous playwright, Luigi Pirandello, at least as far as I know, they didn't meet in person, right, Stefano? But Borges did write a little piece on Pirandello, on a performance of one of Pirandello's plays, calling it, as Stefano writes, praising Pirandello's unique ability to light up on both stage and the contemporary stage the metaphysical perplexity of great style. So these two revolutionary writers and lovers of metafiction, rather than cattivi avversari, sorry about that, might have indeed become allies, but we don't know. Pirandello is kind of for theater, I would say, what Borges is for fiction, right? So there are plenty of encounters here between Italy and Argentina. We know of so much immigration between the two countries, specifically from Italy into Argentina, and Stefano will talk about this a bit later. But for now, we will start our session today by speaking about the Teatro d'Arte founded by Pirandello and a group of friends. There were supposed to be 11, if I remember correctly, precisely because today is exactly 95 years since the opening night of that teatro. It happened on April 2nd, 1925 in Rome, and then Patricia is going to tell us much more about that. So as I already kind of announced, my two guests today are Stefano Boselli and Patricia Gaborik. Hi, Stefano. Hi, Patricia. Thanks for joining me.
Hello.
All right, so Stefano is a New York-based stage director, producer, dramaturg, and teaching artist. He currently teaches theater courses in the Department of Performing and Fine Arts at CUNY, and also at the English program at Centenary University, in addition to a performance-oriented version of great works of literature in the Department of English, precisely at CUNY. He has an MFA in stage directing. He's an experienced actor. He got his degree in Milan on, and he specialized in acting and directing with Yuri Auschwitz in the Russian Academy of Dramatic Arts. He's done quite a lot of training and acting internationally. And also, as you already know from our first Pirandello on Air.
More of a director, actually. I don't act, but I'm a director.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Well, that's even more difficult. You're, Pirandellian director. And he's also the Theater and Performance Outreach Officer of the Pirandello Society of America. And then we have Patricia Gaborik, who, if I remember correctly, Patricia, you're from around the Chicago area.
That's right. In Wisconsin.
So Patricia is currently in Rome, and she teaches theater at the Department of Humanistic Studies at the Università della Calabria and at the Accademia Nazionale d'Arte Drammatica Silvio D'Amico in Rome. She was a fellow in modern Italian studies at the American Academy in Rome in 2005 and 2006, one of the most prestigious awards for Americans in Italy. And here we see another example.
I also have a daughter.
She also has a daughter, and she has edited and translated Watching the Moon and other plays by Massimo Bontempelli. She's the author of Mussolini's Theater, Fascist Experiments in Art and Politics, and she's the editor of Pirandello in Context, forthcoming with Cambridge University Press 2022. And Stefano here, and also our president and journal editors, Michael Subialka and Lisa Sarti, are contributors. So welcome, everyone. Let's get this started. After so much introduction, we have a few topics to discuss today. So, Patricia, tell us about the Teatro d'Arte. How was it founded? What happened specifically around the foundation of this theater? Who were the members? What was the opening night about, etc.?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Anna. Thank you also for reminding us of the date. It didn't actually occur to me that we're at an exact anniversary of that opening. That's really fantastic. So the Teatro d'Arte, and as Anna mentioned, it was initially 11 members, 12 members. This is actually a joke that the members themselves started making about the theater. Massimo Bontempelli in particular wrote an article about it, saying we were the Teatro degli Undici, which was one of its kind of nicknames, o Dodici. We don't really remember if we were 11 or 12. This is also because the initial members, the initial founding members, it was a joint stock company, actually changed in the first year of the company's formation. It was an initiative initially launched by Pirandello's son, Stefano Landi, with Orio Vergani, who was another young playwright, a friend. And they both had this sense that young Italian playwrights didn't really have much of a space for their work. And so they, from these kind of own personal interests, started thinking about what are the possibilities of creating a sort of small experimental theater where they could experiment on their own, but also where they could find an audience for an Italian repertory and new writers in particular. This was a really kind of complicated and vexed question that went beyond a kind of generational problem, because at the time, in general, the intellectual set, let's say, in Italy, who was interested in theater was very frustrated by the really kind of commercial quality of the majority of the Italian repertoire. And also the fact that it was a repertoire that for decades now had been kind of dominated by French bourgeois drama, and so there was this real sense that, there are Italian voices out there that aren't being heard. The younger generation, of course, feeling that problem even more acutely. So they go to Pirandello with this problem, with this idea, and he's kind of instantly taken with it himself as well. And so, they sort of initially go to him, sort of, can you help us out? Can you be an advisor for us? And he really becomes the motor behind the whole project. With, obviously Pirandello at this point in 24, when they start talking about it, already has some stature as a playwright now too, even though that one was a little bit later in coming with respect to his work as a novelist. And so he really had some clout that they could make good use of. They formed this group, this joint stock company, where everybody threw in some money, but they knew that wasn't quite enough. And so they turned to the government. Pirandello went to Mussolini and said, we have this initiative, sort of highlighting, this idea of support for a national repertoire. And Mussolini was interested and contributed.
I read in your article that he even took on the spot his own money purse. He took out a huge bill of lire.
That's right. The group, there was a group of 4 or 5 of them that went to visit him at his office, which was then at Palazzo Chigi, and sort of, and he's, great idea, took out his wallet and handed them these 50,000. That was sort of really exciting. They had this sense that he really gets what we want to do, because if he didn't, he wouldn't give us his own money. The rest of the collaboration, also from an economic point of view, was a little bit more complicated. The state wasn't really ever quite ready to give all of the funds that they discovered they needed, but there was definitely a sort of sense of support there that both the government used and Pirandello and the group used to say, sort of, we have the backing of the fascist government. And also saying to the government, we're bringing you prestige. And so it was a sort of mutual, everything of mutual accord, but also of mutual tensions, sort of to figure out how much do we want to give, and when we give, what is expected of us in terms of allegiance to the political program and right. Those sorts of things. That
was there any of that in what Pirandello wrote and performed during those times? Was there any political allegiance visible, or was he just doing his own thing and hoping that Mussolini wouldn't cut the funding?
I think this is, of course, one of the big debates among the Pirandello scholars who are interested in political questions, is how much can we read in Pirandello's work his supposed fascism, or how much can we how much do we use his work to read against the idea that he was a fascist, even though he was very publicly a member and very publicly spoke in favor of Mussolini. So it's a pretty vexed question there. There's also some interesting stuff there in terms of Argentina. So I don't know if Stefano will sort of, what happens when he goes to Argentina on this political
right.
on this political front. Pirandello himself always argued that he said very specifically, I'm a fascist, but my plays are not political. Right. And so the way that I like to describe this is he would go and he would do his plays. But his idea was, and there was always a great deal of fanfare around the productions of the Teatro d'Arte and around the fact that they were sponsored by the government. But his sort of idea was fascism is just the frame, and my plays are inside that, and they exist on their own. From my perspective, it's inevitable that frame conditions the picture that we see, right? And it was one of the, I think, very vexed things for Pirandello himself, because he wanted to see that work as autonomous. It was very hard for others to see the two
definitely
things.
Benefited from the fascist government, for sure, right? I really liked how in your article, Patricia, this is, if people would like to read it, it's called Roma 2 aprile 1925, c'era Mussolini, Pirandello e il Teatro d'Arte, how you described Mussolini sitting in his his theater booth. And one of the ideas that really appealed to Mussolini in Pirandello's theater was precisely the fact that Pirandello turned the auditorium into the marketplace. La platea era diventata piazza. So you wrote how Mussolini was sitting up there in his theater booth, and with one eye he was looking at the people, and with the other eye he was looking at the play. So this gave him probably some kind of feeling that this was fascist popular theater, because it united the stage with the actual audience.
That's right. You know, I think it's quite interesting in that regard, because he's got this very famous declaration that comes later in 1932, where he says, Pirandello writes fascist plays without even meaning to, without even wanting to. And I think this is one of the things that he's thinking about when he says that. At the same time, you have Corrado Alvaro, who was a good friend of Pirandello and Bontempelli and some of the set who set up this theater, but who initially distanced himself from the enterprise, because he, on the other hand, at that moment was rather anti-fascist. And he writes his review of the evening, and he says, watching these same plays, he says, this is a great sort of condemnation of that sense of the people and this sort of godlike relationship between the ruler and Mussolini. So it's really quite fascinating, because we can imagine Mussolini sitting there and viewing the whole display below him as his celebration, and then you have Alvaro as a reviewer who makes exactly the opposite argument, and that's pretty significant, descriptive of Pirandello's fate still today with respect to his relationship to fascism. I think
this is quite a fascinating picture, because, as you said before, Patricia, so at the time in Italy, it seems that we have a very kind of conservative, traditional view of theater. The actor is at the center. The actor is the superstar of any kind of performance. The topics are, you said, mostly French, so there is no kind of idea of a national theater. So Pirandello and his buddies, when they come onto the stage, they try to revolutionize this, and this is why they get the support of Mussolini. But then you also said how the opening night was quite an event in Rome, that people were so fascinated by it that they even arrived at the theater dressed in the colors of the theater, wearing purple and gold. And Pirandello, right at the beginning of the performance, says, tonight we're not doing popular theater. This is not popular theater. How do we understand this?
That's a great question. I think there are a couple of different things going on there, and one is certainly this sense of we are doing something new. This isn't popular theater. Exactly that thing I was talking about before with repertoire, right? With this is not for a big audience. This is not for a commercial audience. This is for people who are interested in seeing new and challenging work. The question of the actor too is a crucial one, and this isn't just for Pirandello and his group, although of course those kind of artists are particularly invested in the question. There's a sense in Italy that Italy is decades behind neighboring countries in theater practice, precisely because it's still guided by actors. We still have this a traveling troupe system led by the so-called capocomico, right? Whereas for decades now in other countries, there's been the imposition of this director figure who sort of takes over the reins and takes over the sort of the staging of the entire play with a sort of outside perspective.
So just a quick clarification, Patricia. So up until this point, the term director didn't exist in theater.
That's right, and in fact, it doesn't come along in Italy. They don't have the term. The concept is only sort of beginning to emerge. They use French terminology at the time for it, either metteur en scène or régisseur. And it's not until 1932 that they start using the word regista that we use today. And that's behind the initiative of Silvio D'Amico, who's a critic, who co-directs the magazine Scenario with Nicola De Piro, who was the Inspector General of the theater. So he was the sort of fascist representative for the theater arts. They co-direct this journal, and they sort of say, okay, we need to deal with this problem. If we can give this figure our own name, maybe we can make a space for this figure in production today. Pirandello and D'Amico, as well as Anton Giulio Bragalia, who has another small art theater, even though D'Amico and Bragalia are really at odds, they're really the sort of early champions of this, of the director. In Italy. And one of the reasons that the government gets behind this project, I think, is because they too have that sense of we need to modernize, we need to innovate. And these are the guys who want to do that.
Okay, so before Pirandello and D'Amico and Bragalia, we had a situation in which each member of a theater company would be his own or her own separate instrument player, but there was no conductor. They would just practice in isolation and then come together on the stage, hoping that the whole will somehow make it, right?
Right, in a sort of, in the final days, okay, let's start putting all the pieces together. But even that, even that sort of thing where, an actor is rehearsing on his own, they still have a prompter, for example, right? This is one of the big things, and this is one of the questions that comes into the text of 6 characters, right? Who's this prompter figure who has to give them their lines, because they don't even know all their lines on their own. They may not know their cues because they haven't been rehearsing with the other authors. Now, it's not like Pirandello arrives and says, "Hey, let's just do this a new way." Of course, there are sort of bits and pieces, and there are other figures who are sort of sliding toward this approach, also because theater's a really international art at this time. And so, this sort of eye on foreign companies is also because there's a lot of international exchange. But that's one of the things that happens, right? They say, oh, we really like what's happening in other places. Why are we not doing that? On one hand, you have these stupendous Italian actors, who really carry the tradition forward. And on the other hand, you have the sort of the literati of the theater world that say, wait a minute, right? How can we push things in our direction? So
fascinating. So his innovation was kind of, so not that he completely was single-handedly responsible for the revolutionizing of Italian theater, but you wrote that Pirandello really liked what is called table work. So before the performance, he would stand there, talk to all the actors, and he was also a fan of the Stanislavski method, right? He wanted his actors to become the character, not just to recite a part. As you said, they were used to being prompted by someone, because it was so much about how they should show their own talents before. But with Pirandello, it was more about the actor becoming the actual character on stage. He didn't have much tolerance for the actual figure. Although with Marta Abba, he wasn't quite honest there. He wanted Marta Abba, right?
Well, I think that's actually really key, a really key thing you say, because I think Pirandello's experience of this problem and attitude toward this problem changes a lot over the years. And I think certainly part of that change has to do with the Teatro d'arte experience, right? He has this sort of immersion in the work of, he essentially becomes a director. Or a pseudo director or proto director, however we want to call it, right? He's moving in that direction, and I think he probably sees in more concrete ways the beauty of the creativity that an actor can bring. Initially, for everybody who's read some of Pirandello's earlier works and criticism, his real issue is an actor is really, he likens an actor to a translator, right? And there's always this sort of intermediary, but there's this sense that, actors are too into displaying their own talents. to really think about what it is that the so-called poet, right, the playwright, is trying to communicate. So they're kind of a barrier to proper theatrical expression, even though, of course, one would assume that performance is the mode of expression, right? So he has this kind of very complicated, ambivalent thing, which doesn't become less complicated or ambivalent, but I think it becomes more appreciative over the years once he has that contact with the world of theater, and certainly with his, sort of awe of Marta Abba.
Yes,
who was able to impersonate, sort of embody, as he would have said, in ways that he, hadn't expected.
So it's quite revolutionary what he's doing for theater in general at this time. And I think this keeping this idea in mind for later on when Stefano will tell us about the performances in the 90s is quite important. So before we go to Stefano, I just wanted to show again a couple of photos that I have here. So here is the company, the Teatro d'Arte, with Pirandello here and Marta Abba. I think that's her on the left, right? And one... Here is one interpretation of how interesting Mussolini found the performance of the Teatro d'Arte on April 2nd. Il Duce mentre parla Pirandello, il medesimo dopo la sagra del Signore della Nave, lo stesso dopo, secondo l'atto, totally bored and with his beard already growing, and he's usually this clean-cut, polished person, right? So here's one interpretation of what he thought of Pirandello's play. And another thing that I understand was quite revolutionary what Pirandello did is his stage, the way that he staged or required the stage to be decorated for his plays. This was something quite new, Patricia. Was it, at least for Italian audiences? You wrote that the staircase is kind of something that people hadn't seen before in that way. Am I correct? How do we...
Right there in particular, it's the staircase that connected the house to the stage, or the stage to the house. The staircase that you're seeing in the picture here is actually part of the set design for Nostra Dea here, because that is a scene that takes place on a kind of multi-levels. There's a balcony that looks down on the main part of the set that you see here. But two, I mean, this is one of the things. Pirandello hires Virgilio Marchi, who's a futurist, who had also done the work for Bregalia's theater, which is, considered even sort of more avant-garde, let's say, right? That in that true line of avant-gardism and, sort of really radical formal experimentation. The fact that Pirandello brings in that kind of an architect and a designer is really significant for signaling this is all new. And that's part of the thing about a director, right? I'm not just thinking about what the text needs to do, but I'm thinking about the way the lighting, the way the set, the way the actors all have to be coordinated.
Right. It's fascinating. And he resisted this term, the avant-garde. He didn't see himself as part of the avant-garde, because the avant-garde for him was something fleeting, something that is just of the moment, so to say. And they wanted to create something permanently transformative.
Right. There was that. I think it was an issue, a sort of a literary identity issue. I think part of, in this period in particular, part of the resistance to that idea also was because in Rome, his competitor was Bregalia, and Bregalia's Teatro degli Indipendenti was really known as Teatro Sperimentale degli Indipendenti. It's actually kind of an important word there. Produced something like 200 shows a year. I mean, it was just like one new thing after the other, and it was 4 short shows in an evening. And there it was just really the sense of let's get out as many new and interesting things as we can. The thing with Bregalia was everyone sort of looked at that and said, wow, it's really genius. It's not so polished. And Pirandello really wanted polished. I mean, he really wanted that sort of perfect realization of the works that he chose.
Fascinating.
So I think there's an element of that too, right? You know, if avant-garde means, you know, kind of fast and flimsy, then
yeah, totally. That's how I read his literature. He's written his novels as well. It's always in opposition to this kind of fleeting, fast avant-garde. It wants to create something more permanent, more incisive. So on that note, thank you so much, Patricia. We'll continue inserting some of your remarks into Stefano's talk. So now this same Teatro d'Arte, a couple of years later, went to Argentina, to South America. Stefano, tell us about this amazing connection. What was Pirandello doing in Argentina? Who introduced him? How did they receive him?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the reasons why they go is exactly what Patricia talked about earlier: the lack of funding. That money was promised, but then they didn't have enough, and so that's one of the reasons they're hoping to recoup some money, which is what you do now. You build a performance, stage play, and then you hope to have other dates in other places where they will pay you. Another reason was that his daughter, Lieta, had married a Chilean diplomat, and so she was away. I mean, he wanted to see her, and so there was a personal reason.
Yeah, we talked with Daniela Bini about his almost incestuous kind of relationship with his daughter, where he treated her as if she were his wife, basically, right? So he would follow her anywhere.
Well, there was a closeness that was a separation at that point. So that became one of the reasons why he looked at South America in a particular light. It was in like a personal light, of course. But one has to say that a network of tours of Italian companies had started earlier. So there were a number of companies that started about in the 1870s. So as early as the 1870s to utilize this touring circuit. So and I've been looking at one of my interests lately has been networks. So there was a transatlantic network between Europe and South America that was made possible mostly because of the quantity of immigrants of different languages, of course, but Italians were in majority, especially in Argentina, right? So these troops had the opportunity to just move the show in Italian without necessarily translating at the beginning, and then they began to be translated. So
a way of forming an identity, even for the people that were already on the ground, for an Italian company to come there, perform for them, they probably felt more encouraged, more legitimized in their being Argentinians, but also Italians at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, at that point there were immigrants, and one of the reasons, Italians were not seen as the crème de la crème. Usually there were poor Italians getting to Argentina, and so there was a sense of and even the fascist government saw these cultural embassies, ambasciate, and by artists as a way to empower, in a way,
right, with Marinetti
in other countries, and so that there was so there was, once again, there was a network of theater companies already there. There was an audience of Italians who could see it. Sometimes there would be translations outside of Buenos Aires, because mostly, and then again, these companies toured the whole of South America. So it was Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile. Those were included, not just Argentina. And in fact, the way that Pirandello first gets to Argentina is through the company formed by actor manager Dario Nicodemi, who gets to present the first version, the 1921 version of 6 characters, in Argentina first, right? And so that's the way that he becomes known in Buenos Aires and then Montevideo, Rio de Janeiro. First, I'm not going to spend too much time on that on that production. I want to get a little bit later. You know, the first his Pirandello with the Teatro dell'Arte has his first experience of South America in 1927. So 25, right? The premiere that we've seen, and just 2 years later, he sails towards South America on the Revitorio, the ship, with a company that included Marta Abba, Lamberto Picasso as the main, lead actors. And then it debuts in Buenos Aires with Diana and Tuda, and then performs 13 works by Pirandello and 4 by other authors, both in Buenos Aires and in Cordova, Rosario, and Bahia Blanca. So the main play, once again, was 6 characters that had 13 performances there.
If he saw it, I'm sure he loved it. That is a play that Borges could have written, for instance. No.
Right. And so that was that was his first experience, and the one where he was really leading the way. He was part of the Teatro d'Arte. I have to say, I wanted to add something to what Patricia said earlier. So one of the reasons why these people had the suggeritore, right, the prompter, was also that there were so many works that were juggling at the same time, right? We're used now to having just one play staged and the actor is playing just that one play. But at the time, these guys were traveling around Italy and South America and some other area, and also North America, with 15 plays, right? And so
they didn't have social media, so they could focus better on their work.
Right. And so it was difficult to do. Stanislavski style acting usually meant that people spend maybe 6 months to 2 years playing that particular play and refining it, just the one. More or less, right? Russian style is really sometimes long. It used to be with Stanislavski could afford it, who was a rich guy who could afford it. They could go on be 2 years on a play, but the Teatro d'Arte certainly could not afford to do it. And so there were some overlaps. For example, the Marta Abba was criticized for basically playing sometimes the stepdaughter of the 6 characters in other plays, right? So it's difficult to invent, a completely, the Italian theater was based on roles. So once you had that role, then similar roles were given you in other plays. And so it was difficult to then change that role to be something completely different. Right?
So Pirandello was quite demanding in that sense. He wanted people to really transform, but there was just no time for that, right?
He was, and we could say that he starts being a director the moment he started writing such detailed stage directions, right? We have Pirandello stage directions that, along with others, Bernard Shaw, towards that, a certain area of theater history, there's a point where playwrights begin writing so much in detail what they want, especially, the actor needs to be blonde, tall, and thin. How was that possible? But it was the idea of having those roles, right, that were kind of staples of how theater worked. I'd say that since, I don't know, Goldoni or even earlier, perhaps in Italy.
What were some of the challenges, for instance, when he came to Buenos Aires and they were about to stage some of his plays? What were the challenges of staging Pirandello in Argentina, and how did the audience react? How was the reception? Also, the next question, I guess, would be, did he present himself as fascist when he arrived there?
Right. So, well, that's the thing. I mean, as Patricia mentioned earlier, on the one hand, he had to be, in Italy especially, he had to declare to Mussolini, we're going to do fascist theater around the world, so you should give us money so that we can do that. But then, when he arrived in Argentina, one problem, was, the press in Argentina was very strong, one of the newspapers, one of the daily newspapers that was more like vocal against fascism was Critica, and the director Botana decided that he wanted to be aggressive against this kind of fascist tour which he saw, and so he entrusted one of his critics to write against this. But eventually, the critic himself was convinced that Pirandello wasn't really a fascist in terms of propaganda, right?
Oh wow! All right.
So the aspect of his art really shine, and actually Pirandello was really welcomed with public
fanfare and
he was recognized. He had contacts with actors in Argentina. The press related how when he left, people were waving handkerchiefs. That kind of, so he had the fame of a star actually. And he was planning. He planned 3 trips to Argentina. To your question, the second time he went was the first time he was basically bringing his own plays already that he had directed, right, basically, right? So that was it. It was his own staging. But the second time, I think, relates to your question more, because he, at some point of his life, Pirandello was kind of in exile, right? He was in France, he was in Paris. He was looking for someone to produce Quando si è qualcuno, when one is somebody.
Okay, the one in which he's very explicit about Marta Abba, and there are many biographical references in it, so people found it controversial, I guess, because of
right, exactly. That was one of the main reasons why it was difficult to find people. He tried to find someone in Italy, but the Ruggeri company decided that it wasn't a good fit. And so basically what happened is that he received an offer from the Odeon Theater in Buenos Aires, directed by Enrique Susini. And so he was worried about this because this would be the world premiere. So there was a world premiere of Pirandello play in Argentina rather than in Italy, which was, of course, paradoxical, right, in itself, I think. And so he made a lot of arrangements. He through a mediator, Giuseppe Giacompol, and he arrived and basically, so a prominent director was tasked to direct the play. Antonio Cunil Cavanellas, sorry. But Pirandello thought that the casting was wrong. So he thought that the protagonist was too fat, too well-fed, not fat, but too well-fed, let's say, to play the character, and other changes. And so basically, he snuck into the rehearsal room and took over.
Oh my God! Yeah.
So there was
why he became a director.
Famous director, but Pirandello began, talking, and even if he couldn't speak Spanish, in full detail, he basically took over, and so that was, kind of one way that he became, he really, embraced his role as director, but he also pushed someone over the cliff.
Right.
But that also tells us how precisely he wanted his work to function, to work with specific actors. Now we don't have so much time, but I wanted to say, so using this as a trampoline, using this idea of Pirandello changing things in Argentina, I wanted to jump a few years.
Sure. there's like a second stage of a Pirandello revival.
Pirandello.
So probably I can hear myself for some reason though. There's some echo. Okay,
I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. I think what we should keep in mind though, for this first kind of stage of productions, Pirandello productions in Argentina, is he was very well received, and he was perceived as an innovator, as someone on whose work or method Argentine theater should be based on. They looked up to him, the Argentine directors at the time, if I understood correctly, and the audience just loved him. And one critic, from what I read from your paper, Stefano, said that this is not a performance that one should talk about in Argentina, but one should let know all the four corners of the globe about how good Pirandello plays are. This is how well received he was in the 1920s. And then now we jump to the 1990s, when it seems was something quite different. Tell us about it, Stefano.
Well, always in the in the realm of those networks that I've been looking into, my latest investigations in Argentine theater had to do with a group of so-called Argentines of Paris, which is a number of artists and theater people who moved from Argentina and made their careers in Paris mostly, but are now coming back to Argentina, and then began coming back after the 80s, when Argentina became was more open to politically, let's say. And so one of these directors is of Italian heritage, actually, Jorge Lavelli, who started his born in 1934. Originally he started his career in Argentina with the so-called Teatro Independiente, independent theater, so experimental theater. Then in 1960s, he moved to Paris. He made a career there mostly, and he became one of the directors who at some point was given a national theater, which he renamed Teatro de la Colline. And he was the artistic director, so therefore of a state funded French theater for 10 years. So that's how we can tell that he became famous, he became influential in France mostly. So his relationship with Argentina in the meantime was not frequent. He did go to Argentina in the meantime, presenting productions that have been staged in France, and then so they were basically transported to Argentina and shown as they were done there. But in the case of Pirandello, was different. So this happened basically right after he ended his relation with the Teatro de la Colline. Teatro de la Colline had as an artistic statement the idea that it would only stage contemporary plays, not classics. So at the end of that period, in which he had clarity, but also he couldn't do classics basically because of what the theater was planning to do and he had chosen for that theater, he decided that his first classic would be Pirandello, and so he did direct 6 characters at the Théâtre National Populaire, which at the time was not in Paris but in Villeurbanne. So this was his first production with his own company after 10 years. He used an Italian set designer, Pace, just the name, just the one name, and also an Italian costume designer. But the production felt, let's say that production felt a little bit flat. It wasn't particularly original. Some of the critics said, well, he doesn't innovate at all.
Right.
And one of them commented that basically Lavelli seemed more interested in the costumes or in the furniture, which looked very, very pretty, very perfect. But
Italian, right?
It could have been, like a fashion magazine or a furniture magazine type of furniture, but nothing big was happening, right?
So was this a criticism?
Sorry, Anna, go on.
I was just going to ask, was this a criticism on Pirandello, that Pirandello's play is not innovative enough or not that interesting? for Lavelli's production.
That's a good point. It was about the way that he directed the play, right? Because by now, whereas when I spoke about Pirandello in Argentina earlier, this was like contemporary playwriting, right? So it was the first time it was seen, it was new. One of the problems with Pirandello today is that, well, how do you make it new again, right?
True.
So
that's the big challenge.
Me, as a director, that becomes a problem, because we're already used to a lot of it, like meta theatricality. I mean, what is a character coming onto the stage? Well, of course we've seen it. We're made of it, right? So how do you make it innovative? And so, there have been other ways that this has been done. There's an article by our co-president Gianna Bazzoni. I think I want to find it. Yes, okay. So I'm just going to put a couple of things in the chat. So those are copied there. A couple of books. The first one is an article by Gianna, who spoke about ideas of what has been done in terms of staging Pirandello in more recent times. So people can get there and
that's great.
And then there's another book, earlier book by Richard Sogliuzzo on Pirandello's director. So those are two just references. So again, we're talking about directing Pirandello, right? So earlier it was Pirandello directing himself, right? And now it's other directors trying to direct Pirandello. So that was a little bit of and my sense was that Lavelli had become so comfy in his idea of how you can plan theater, right? A year in advance, that things have become a little bit stale. Well, during the same time, he was preparing this production in France, which is not the one we're seeing now, but this is the Argentine one. He was also producing another one in Argentina. With the exception, I mean, this was the same play, but with different cast, different designers, etc. Right? I didn't get you, and I'm sorry, the French version, but basically, it was a more intimate situation with a lot of furniture, not too much, but simple furniture. And so once he got to Argentina, the situation became very paradoxical, and therefore, I think, more interesting. Of course, not for the director who was directing Pirandello there, because a lot of things didn't go through, but because this added a dimension of meta theatricality and realness to the directing of Pirandello.
Nothing really worked, right? The one actor didn't show up.
So there were a number of problems. One of them was that the contracts for the actors were extremely tight. They could be dismissed without cause, and the actors rebelled first. And then there were problems getting the set done. So when I went to the archives, and the pictures that you show are from the just to give credits, from the Centro de Documentación Teatro y Danza at the Teatro San Martin. So basically, because the furniture wasn't being built quick enough, the stage remained kind of empty and sparse, right? And this is a huge stage, the Sala Martín Coronado at the Teatro San Martín, Teatro Municipal San Martín. And so it's a huge stage, really big, in which, it is said that, the spectators in the back can see, the actors in very small size, but they can hear every single thing that is being said, including the mistakes. So it's kind of a paradoxical stage. And so here you can see how Graciela Galan, who was the director, the set designer for the director, and the lights, also authored partially by Lavelli, were trying to create a particular space. And so then, just before the premiere, one of the actors went on strike without saying why. People thought he might have been kidnapped or he might have had a serious health problems, but it was a matter of his name not being large enough on the playbill in the theater according to the contract. So there was a whole querelle there, which the journalist, once again, so the press gave a bit by bit description of what happened during rehearsals with the actors, etc., saying this one day will be one production for the annals of theater. And I think it's time to write something about it, and so that's what I've been looking into.
That's fascinating. So the two productions in Paris and in Buenos Aires in the 90s were a flop. In one case because it was just not innovative enough, and in Buenos Aires because it was just a total mess and actors didn't show up, didn't have contracts.
So once again, for the actual director of the play at that point, it must have been painful, right? And there were people who felt sick, so there were problems right there. But it is my contention that because of all these elements that happened, the production, became more in line with Pirandello's idea of there being some improvisation, there being some unexpected things going on, because if the 6 characters, arrive onto the stage, it's something surprising, right? So things were happening that made things not so well oiled, but at the same time, I think, more fascinating. It's certainly fascinating to study them because you can see you're opening this black box where, otherwise you got the production, a name, okay, that happened. But when you open the black box, you see all the details of this production. These are, I think, beautiful costumes.
Yeah. So Stefano, how did you get into this? What led you to Buenos Aires to do this specific research and to find all these images? Is there a big archive there? I understand some personal background there as well, some personal history.
Okay, so one of the reasons I got interested in Argentina was because my mom lived there for 11 years, and today it so happens to also be her birthday. So
Auguri.
So that was one of the reasons, and then for my my most recent PhD, I had I met with Jean Graham Jones, who is a specialist of Argentine theater, where I studied for my PhD. So the dissertation that I wrote then was about Argentinians.
And how accessible are the archives? Like, how much is there of Pirandello there? What was your feeling?
Right. I visited 3 times, and the first 2 times the archive was being reorganized. So I couldn't access anything. So this part of the research at the Pirandello one belongs to the 3rd time I had to go. This didn't go into the dissertation, but now it's open.
Well,
the good thing. I mean, there's an incredible quantity of materials that has been gathered there, and once again, the press. In this particular case was extremely precise. Everything was aired, right? Even the dirty laundry. Whereas sometimes, for example, the French were less interested in the production, so there's less material, at least that I found in Paris.
So there's so much work to be done once we can travel again. To discover Pirandello maybe he did even meet Borges. Who knows? That would be something I would be very, very interested in. Fascinating. Yeah. Well, so thank you so much, Stefano. Thank you, Patricia. I have 2 last questions. So one is, Stefano, from what I read in your articles, why didn't they want the translation of the 6 characters into the Porteño dialect, or some specific question concerning the language in which the actors were going to perform in Buenos Aires? What happened there?
Right. So, Lavelli has always been a director who wanted to do theater for that's not too localized. And so, for example, he would work in Spain and Argentina. No, so I think that's one reason he wouldn't want to have different translations there. Originally, the translation was commissioned to a journalist who wrote. Again, Argentine theater is very localized, right? The accent is different. There are so many Italian words in there. And not only, but the sense was that the Porteño version would be too folkloristic, maybe, right? And so it would not belong to the idea that Pirandello had of his theater, which ties in with what Patricia was saying earlier. We do, and Joanna also mentioned, we are not doing, like you were saying, theater for popular theater, right? So that the folkloric part. This is not, and Pirandello, I mean, he wrote, plays in dialect in Sicilian, right? So, but at some point, with 6 characters, that's a play that really plays into a more transcendental, general sense of what theater is. So if you make it too folkloric or too tied to a particular, I call it dialect, then it becomes something just too too low in terms of level, right? Then what would be for everyone, right? And touching those metaphysical depths that Pirandello was I think meant to do, right?
So I guess the only way to touch metaphysical depths is to perform in a Spanish accent in Buenos Aires. Amazing.
More diluted, more general. It's like in Italian. In Italian, you don't necessarily play in dialect. You will use this kind of fake language that came from TV, from Rai and Rai diction, that doesn't really exist. It's not spoken, but that's the Italian you speak. And so Pirandello is more or less at that point in terms of the particular register of Italian that he's using.
Fascinating. All right, so to wrap up the conversation, both of you are in theater. Stefano, you're a director. How can we direct Pirandello today? Do you have any message, any instructions for people out there who would be interested in directing Pirandello? Because we said it's so specific to him, what he did in his plays. He was the mastermind behind the staging, behind the coordination of the actors. So how can we bring him today into our times and make him as innovative as in the time when he actually directed his own plays? Or to follow up on this question, so that will be the first part of my question. The second one, have you both seen productions of Pirandello that felt truly Pirandellian, something that he would have approved of today?
I wouldn't even try to begin to say what I think Pirandello would approve of. There probably wouldn't be much.
Stop producing my plays. So just leave it alone. Read them.
I think I don't know. To get to both of those questions, I would say we have to trust the play. We have to trust the play. One of the, I have to say, I sort of had this sense, this problem that we're talking about today, I think plagues Pirandello like it plagues all classics, whether it's, an author as a classic or a particular play, like 6 characters is, it sort of has this monumental weight, but also weight in the sense of, people feel like it's, aren't we done with that? Or okay, it was that, and we're something different. And I sort of had this thing that I appreciated 6 characters, and I know why I'm supposed to appreciate 6 characters. And I felt that way for about 20 years from the first time I read it until I saw a studio production by Luca Ronconi with the students of the Italian National Academy of Dramatic Arts. And what's interesting after the fact is Ronconi himself in an interview and, sort of in program notes talked about this sense that, we feel like Pirandello is so weighted today. And also the same thing that Stefano said earlier, this whole question of fiction, reality, we all feel like we live that problem already, right? We're past it. So that can't really be what inspires about Pirandello's play today. I'm not sure I totally follow Ronconi in that, but his sense was, so that's not what it's about. Like, that's not what makes this play live today. And I think, and so he sort of said, I'm going to take these actors who are student actors, it's an academy, a conservatory training program, and I'm going to take them back to the characters and say, okay, let's forget about all of that meta theater. Let's forget about all of that. Let's go back to these characters. And I think that's very wise. And I think one of the things that, as whoever comes to the theater as a practitioner rather than as a sort of literature person, when you look at a play, you look for the action, and when you're an actor, you try to play the action, not the idea. I think Pirandello suffers a lot from the idea that we need to play the idea, right? And so that would be, it's very vague, but that would be my sense. When Lisa Sarti and Michael Subialka and Carlo Di Lieto, I think it was 2 weeks ago, launched their book in Pirandello On Air. This was a point that Lisa touched on in particular, where she sort of said there's so much that's philosophical in Pirandello, but that just doesn't mean that philosophy always needs to lead when we read Pirandello. And I think that's particularly true when you're thinking about actually staging them. The questions need to be a little bit different.
Right. Yes. There was a project that the University of Catania was trying to start with European funds about 2 years ago, bringing Pirandello's theater into community schools, into refugee camps also in Sicily. That would have been, I think, something really, truly wonderful to do, to have the plays being staged by immigrants, also to kind of adapt the plays to our times. But then, unfortunately, the pandemic happened and all of that was canceled. Yeah,
that would actually be a good idea. I think. I think we should take the lesson from Tonight We Improvise, where we, the theater, Pirandello's theater, I think should be revived by actually doing etudes and doing improvisations, and maybe going back to school to do that, so that it's not so perfect again. And so the ideas become secondary, but they then shine. But you need to be in the action, and so improvising those plays is I think.
Absolutely. Agreed. And especially now with this Zoom era in which we're living, I mean, that I feel brings so much, that serves as Pirandello, basically. He would be such a useful author and playwright to interpret, or kind of to live this period through. But we still, hopefully it's not going to last for long, but that would be something I would like to see, like an adaptation of Pirandello, 6 characters through Zoom. I think you would have appreciated that.
Yes, there has been one actually. I'll send you.
Yeah. Send me the link, Stefano, and I can put it on our Facebook page, because I think that's truly fascinating. That's bringing Pirandello to our times. All right. So, anything you'd like to share at the end? Any projects you might want to advertise before we finish our conversation? All right.
Project is going back to normal life. I think it's going to be good.
Yeah, that's a good project.
In New York, theaters are reopening. Yeah. So finally,
wow.
Seems like we're back to something live soon-ish. Maybe in 6 months, it's going to be close to normal. So we're looking forward, I think, everyone to
right. It's been really hard on the theater folks from what I followed. Yeah, well, let's hope we get out of that soon. All right, thank you so much, Patricia and Stefano. This was really wonderful, a wonderful conversation. I know nothing about theater, but at least today I learned something about Pirandello's theater, and I'm very thankful for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna, to you.
All right. So join us next time. We will take a little break now from our interviews, but we will reconvene on April 30th, in which I will discuss Pirandello, the poet, with a few friends of mine from Sicily and generally Italy. They're young published poets. Some of them are translators, and we will be reading Malgiocondo in the edition by the independent publishing house Ensemble from Rome. So if you're interested, please purchase this book from Ensemble's website, and we will be discussing it here on April 30th together. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day. Buona Pasqua domani. Ci sentiamo. Arrivederci.
Bye.